All right, so our final speaker today, last but certainly not least, is Joe Klein with Disrupt 6. As many of you know, or perhaps know, Joe is a well-noted speaker for security, privacy, and I say those two in separate spots because they're very different sorts of things. And Joe, I don't know. I mean, how many different ways can we talk about being an expert in various fields? But we're very lucky to have him today to talk to us a little bit about IPv6 and some threat matrix stuff that he's been working on over the last few months. And I think it's a perfect topic to end up the day. So, Joe?
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Hello, everybody. Oh my God, that's horrible. Hello, everybody. All I have to say is this is so typical. Security is last. My name... Yes, thank you, Owen. My name is Joe Klein. I've been part of the IPv6 community since... sitting at a restaurant bar, challenging and discussing about 15 years ago, security vulnerabilities within IPv6. And Vince Cerf and Jim Bound gave me hell and challenged me to start focusing on it. And I thought it was pretty cool. So I've kind of grokked onto this domain for a very long time. Today, we're going to talk about threat intelligence in the age of IoT and dual stack environments. In the last year, I set up a company specifically around IPv6 only security products. We're going to talk about threat intel, which is a big missing thing right now from a security perspective. We're going to talk about some of the really big holes that currently exist that you're not aware of it. And once you start finding these, you're going to be very surprised about how bad some things are. Anybody seen The Imitation Game? Oh, now I can see the hands of all the geeks. Yes. Well, this is a perfect example of threat intelligence. Okay, not cyber threat intelligence. I guess it could be cyber because he had to build a computer. Turing had to build a computer to try to get through the cryptographic controls around this data stream. So they had a really good gathering collection system. Except it had to be cleansed. It had to go through some filters. He built those filters using these computer systems. You had to derive really what was a hazard right now and in the future, which is what threat intelligence is and what he did. And also provide informed decisions. Yes, they may choose to take action or they may not choose to take action, but at least you have the knowledge to be able to take action, which is very interesting because Gartner Group pretty much says the same thing. Evidence-based knowledge, knowledge with context. Right now, a lot of our lists, our blacklists, have no context on when they were found, when they should expire, if they're still useful, that kind of information, how it was collected, how it was validated. Mechanism that was used for validation, indicators of compromise, indicators of discovery, also actionable advice. How many blacklists have actionable advice? Not many. Of existing or emerging menace hazards to assets. This is a real good definition, especially considering IPv6, some of the things we're going to discuss. Vulnerabilities have been around since 2001. We'll talk about that in a minute. First, has anybody seen the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin? Teach you a little bit of security goodness. This is the process that any hacker, any nation state, or any criminal goes through. First, they go through a pre-compromise, a compromise phase, and a post-compromise phase. For pre-compromise, for recon, they go through email harvesting. They go through that whole list. You guys can read the slides later. Weaponize it, deliver it, exploit it, install it. Command and control is what the CC is, and also some type of action. It's interesting because once a compromise is performed, this is an iterative process. Therefore, this will take place laterally across a lot of infrastructures. Well, why do we care? Because this group is pretty much focused on networks. These are the two major categories that we have to deal with to make sure that we have controls in place to stop or at least slow some of these compromises. So first thing, everything to your left is microsense to stop an account, an attack. Everything to the right could be in the tens, hundreds of millions of dollars cost to fix a problem. Here's the framework that we use. By the way, everything in red has only been suggested in the last 3 years based on standards for credit cards, HIPAA, FISMA. Everything in black has been sitting there for a long time. This is really good stuff, right? We get lots of blinky lights. Has this solved anything? Well, not quite. So, any good compromise, and as an example, we could sit down in less than an hour, 75% of organizations could be compromised. Except it takes months, 80%, to detect it. It takes days to contain it, but it's typically not discovered by IT, networking, or security. It's typically a phone call from law enforcement, or a customer, or an auditor. Are we succeeding at security? Anybody agree? Yeah, me too. That's why we have jobs. This is, by the way, from the newest Verizon data breach report. Really good read if you want to bring this up on justifying equipment and technologies. So let's talk about the adoption rate of IPv6 for the different platforms. Everything in black is capable. Okay? Capable means that a little bit of additional software and some configuration IPv6 would be enabled. Green means it was enabled by default. So IBM, AIX goes all the way back to 97. IBM, OS mainframe, Cisco, Microsoft. By the way, the arrows are there because Microsoft is confusing. Yes, she's gone, so this works. Hi, if you're listening in. Microsoft went through a point where they enabled XP IPv6 by default. A lot of customers didn't know it. So in 100% of the environment today, we do have IPv6. We also saw Apple finally get to it, and Android and the Linux community. So everything that's green was an attack surface that could be exploited in your organization. This goes all the way back to 2001. So just to give you a little bit of reference, I have the badges there from the test and the World Day and the enablement of DNS for IPv6. Well, are you aware that the first published compromise was a tunnel compromise, and it was published in 2002? So you may say, so where the heck is the first one? Well, they posted it on a mailing list, and everybody said, I wonder if we'd been compromised by this recently. That's when people found that they were compromised a year later. By 6.4, which had only been finalized as specification through IETF 6 months before. First, malware. A lot more malware. Teredo was found to not have a firewall, an inbound firewall. Therefore, if attackers could figure out an IP address, they had the ability to go in, have access to NetBIOS commands. Some backdoor code was discovered. The first THC toolkit, covert channel toolkit was released. Rootkits and additional flaws in Teredo, which made the ability to identify them come up. We saw a mobile attack. This was a Sprint phone with a Microsoft 5.5 that if you knew it was running 6.4, But the 6-to-4 was not running on the Sprint network. It was running on one of the associated BGP, and it was generating anycast addresses. Well, this gave every phone a IPv6 address that was mappable to an IPv4 address. So pretty entertaining. We also found botnet CNC, which if you want to hear about that, we can discuss it later. NIST came out with their standard, which we have several people in the audience that helped define it. We saw the first DDoS. Now, this was pretty neat. Arbor Network, somebody I really respect, enabled IPv6 this year. They finally saw DDoS because they enabled their products. A lot of the DDoS products didn't start enabling IPv6 until later, so they could even see DDoSs. So this is kind of what's been going on. Public evasion tools, by the way, the public evasion tools today, we can still get around, attackers can still use these evasion tools to get around most intrusion detection prevention systems. There's one behavior-based system that it can't be gotten around, but that's not the standards it's used in the field. We saw the CIO Council definition of IPv6, and we saw additional hacking tools come out. We saw training for hacking, spam, and also more IDS, IPS issues that came out. Lastly, IPv6 was added to Metasploit. So attackers have been able to create a reverse tunnel using Teredo and maintaining a long-term access. I've talked to some of these pen testers that get engagements that are 1 month or 1 year, and some of those CNC channels are still there after 2 years, even after they made recommendations to fix it. So this is a real problem. Nmap finally added IPv6, and now we have 5 major attack tools. So this set of compromises has been going on for a long time, and the security community has pretty much ignored it, even with IPv6 enabled on their services. And people say, hey, there's no published vulnerabilities. Well, actually there is. A lot of them have been delayed. Some of them haven't been published through the NIST National Vulnerability Database. They've been held for a year to a year and a half. We're still waiting for them to be published, so that downturn will probably raise very quickly. So let's talk about the first issue, tunnels, transition, and proxy problems. Yes, I like this graphic. I'm always told, hey, there's only 3 tunnel, transition, and proxies we ever see. Well, actually there's 32 variations, and there are several that are nation state modified. And by the way, attackers don't play by standards. Teredo has a default port. Actually, Microsoft created 2 additional default ports. The attackers, once they have access to a Microsoft box, they just change the default port. For 6-to-4, they can change the address, same as they can for the Teredo and all these other systems. So this is pretty substantial. Most people running current IDSs aren't going to see a lot of this. Some of the more esoteric systems, Tor has the ability to tunnel IPv6 over IPv4. We see WebRTC, which now allows a IPv6 peer-to-peer network to be set up. I2P has just added it, TIC, obviously VPN, and many, many proxies. And again, then very specifically targeted nation-state or criminal pieces of code that have been dropped onto these systems. Interestingly enough, how many of these tools do you think are called out by security companies as potential security problems? This is considered a low severity problem by Symantec and pretty much the rest of the community. This has been here for 5 years and it's not been changed. This is the same thing with pretty much everybody in the domain. Because of this, there's a lot of testing that's not performed to see if somebody dropped a tunnel protocol, a piece of code onto your system. One of the interesting things, one of the inventories that I did was I went and pulled every piece of code for every variation of tunnels. Well, I found several of them, the way I found out they were nation state is they themselves were backdoored that had callbacks to yet another country. So be aware where you get your tunnel code that's not built into your system. So I find this kind of interesting. This could be the attitude why we've been seeing a slow roll on IPv6 products, and security being the guys that are holding back deployment many times. So 2 common attacks, we've talked about them before. Very simple. Somebody wants to go to Facebook. They go through the firewall. We're seeing insider is attacked, malware, something is put onto a machine on the segment. Now, they use a literal. Why? Because they're security products that block quad A queries. This has been used to get around a lot of firewalls by the community for many years. Okay? IPv6, obviously they have to know where the transition point is. I get to the transition point, I get out. I see more IPv4. The nice thing about it is now this becomes an inbound transit to then pivot into a network. This whole process tested takes about 4 minutes. Compromise the system, set it up, it report back, and then pivot through an environment. Kind of a problem. Yes, and then bad guys are in your network. These address literals are a real problem for a lot of security products. They don't understand how to manage them, and they don't have enough storage many times to address these issues. Rogue routers, we've seen this more than once. Before bad guy puts malware on it, again points to a pivot point, claims I'm a router, redirects all the traffic. Now you're seeing nothing but UDP traffic or SSH traffic or whatever other traffic that's occurring. More IPv4, yes. So, a question for you. How many active tunnel, transition, and translation and proxy endpoints do you think exist in the public internet today? 100? Anybody? 1,000? Anybody? Plus 10,000? Anybody? Yeah, none of the above? It's actually plus 10,000. One of the things we've done is we've created and scanned the IPv4 infrastructure for all variations of attack tools, and I've identified specific transition and endpoints signatures, which have been very interesting, but we've also identified the IPv6 side so we can figure out where it's coming from. Pretty cool. Equivalence and context. This is a big problem for attacks. The reason is some attackers will come in with via v4, set up the command and control via v6, pivot via combination of v4 and v6 without context that those addresses are the same addresses. Many of the protection systems in our field have no way of detecting that they're leveraging both stacks. Okay? Both of those are triangles. Some people think the one to your right is IPv6, but that's a whole nother issue. Some of the problems in the Security Operations Center domain is, does this have an equivalent IPv6 address or addresses? Ooh, you're using a different font. That's why everything's running together. Is there equivalent to this for IPv4? How is it represented? Oh, by the way, there's lots of additional representations. I've seen in the wild, I've seen use of octal I've seen use of other encoding methods to make this even more difficult to find. Base 34, base 36. Also, is it a host? That endpoint, is it a host? Is it attached to a CGN? Is it a tunnel? On v6, is this a router address? Is this a host address? And what is a subnet? These are all issues that haven't been worked out for the security community right now. We've been working on identifying it. We've identified a lot of endpoints at this point. Impact of legacy on cyber threat intelligence. Well, have you ever walked along a dirt road after a nice rain and you walk in and you have to look for the mud? Then sometimes you have puddles and you don't know how deep they are. Well, that's essentially what we have today, because this is the model many of the security community have, end to end. We have NAT, which they understand NAT. They understand NAT on NAT, but they really don't understand NAT on NAT. And they understand CGN. What's the interesting thing about CGN is I tried an experiment from a hotel room. I was bored one day. And I knew the carrier, and I decided, hey, I'm going to go after this really well-known honeypot from my IPv4 address and see if I can get it banned. I was going through a carrier-grade NAT. So I sent a bunch of bad traffic. I got banned. I sent a bunch of more traffic. I got banned. I sent a bunch of more traffic. I got banned. I waited a couple days. Lo and behold, it showed up on a lot of the blacklists. I then had to run around and turn off and call people and have them please remove those from the blacklist. But this has been taking place unless your CGN or your transition technology has the ability to detect for this kind of stuff. This could literally stop anybody going to your organization by using this particular technique. Think about a bank. Somebody wants to go through a CGN for a major carrier. They run this for a couple weeks. The whole carrier is blocked. Bank does new business. They get lots of calls on the help desk because every 2 minutes or every 15 minutes the address changes. So therefore, they're working again by the time the phone system catches up and they get a real person online. This also impacts VPNs and a lot of other things. Yeah, IPsec doesn't like this at all. I checked. So a lot of the blacklists can't be trusted. A lot of them follow each other when you actually look at the blacklist community. With this particular technique, I pulled in over 700 blacklists, and I followed who is following whom and who actually lost context that it was from this particular carrier on this particular day, and it was a carrier-grade NAT. Again, this becomes really important because if you don't know this, you can allow your organization to be DDoS. This becomes a business issue. This becomes lots of calls from the CEO. Geolocation. This is really fun. So I went to all the geolocation providers because, well, I did for both V4 and V6. V4 was approximately 30 to 100 miles away. Let's take a look at the V6. No IPv6 support. They recommend a surveillance application on your cell phone so that they can track you and where you've been. That's pretty entertaining. Yeah, they support dotted quads. Missed me by 300 miles. Dorothy, I'm in Kansas. In the middle of Kansas. That's a few thousand miles away. These guys missed me by 30 miles. This one had no results at all. This one, I was no place. I was blank. No comments, Jeremy. This one was totally questionable. I was just questioned. Nothing came out of this. I tried this with multiple addresses. Why is this important? Have you seen the cute little attack graphics that we see in the security field where we see sources and destinations and, little pew, pew, pew sound effects? They're attempting to use this kind of information and providing false information where attacks are coming from. This is a pretty severe issue. I mean, wouldn't want to see people to go to war on Kansas just because somebody's geolocation service wasn't right. Ah, yes. That one was fun. Internal error. Now, let me give you a story that I just ran into. I have this database up and operational. It's been pretty cool. So, has anybody heard of swatting? That's where somebody does a false caller ID and makes a call to the police and says, hey, they're holding me at gunpoint, and SWAT team shows up and bad things can ensue. Well, there's another technique that's been taking place for about 8-9 years. It's become more popular. And that is somebody will take a bunch of child porn, which in the United States is illegal, and they will try to post it on mailing lists, on anything they can. They'll find FTP servers and drop it on it, and then they'll call the FBI and say, hey, they're hosting child porn. That can be really bad for your business, right? So I looked it up for V4, and that's the location it said for the domain name. Then I looked up the reverse address, and that's the location I found. I said, hey, this doesn't make sense. Provide me a packet trace. This guy does a really good job of providing packet traces. So he provided me a packet trace, and I found out that he was going through a proxy. We pulled the proxy header, and we found that he was located here. With the additional geolocation, we were able to identify the street that the individual was on. This was real important because the FBI had already received the call. So we made the call, we provided the evidence so that he wouldn't be the equivalent of swatted with FBI coming out. Blacklists. By the way, back to the geolocation. Depending on the code that you're using, if it doesn't know where you're coming from, it may give you arbitrary coordinates. So if you have geolocation from some of these providers and you're depending on them for other things, your marketing people, where the money's from, this can be a real problem. You have to be really cautious on selecting a geolocation, guys. Blacklists. Barracuda, they support IPv6, but that's an invalid address. Actually, it's not an invalid address. Spamhaus. Spamhaus does a really good job. I actually had this put on the blacklist and then had it removed. It's supposed to come back with an entry that it was on the blacklist. Many of the blacklists report false information because they don't support IPv6. So they'll say, oh, this IPv6 address was never seen because we don't support IPv6. There's another one, failed or invalid format. I'm not sure why I even got this error message. This was really weird. Are blacklists trusted? Again, if it fails wrong for you, you're going to allow mail to come into your operation. Also, based on the studies I've done across the internet, allocation of IPv6 addresses can be a /64 or anything, typical stuff. But depending on the cloud provider or the organization that's providing the service, they may only give you a single /128 or a /124, although the whole /64 is allocated. So be aware that if you're blocking something, you may or may not be able to block the correct address range depending on what system you're using for blacklisting, for email, for proxy, that kind of stuff. Advanced detection. Okay, a little bit more theory here. Pyramid of pain. This is basically understanding that doing a file hash for a host system is pretty easy. Really easy for IPv4. We look at the net block, blah, blah, blah. Domain names, we can look that up. We can look up network artifacts, headers and things like that, tools. It's really tough to be able to profile who the attacker is. This is a really interesting problem. Now, the problem with this is theoretical, and this is what the rest of the community for security is doing. Unfortunately, we have a problem. We have two stacks we're dealing with, unassociated stacks. File hashes for applications are different if they're v4 or v6 only or dual stack. So now you're talking about 3 hashes for every project, for every component, and then the tunnel type that could be used. Mapping between v4 and v6. v6 can be scannable if they work off of nibble boundary and it's well defined, or they publish their information. The big problem here is that v4 is a 1-to-1 or 1-to-n correlation, and once we actually have carrier grade NAT, it's a 1-to-n to the x times t. So that's a difficult thing to do a 1-to-1 correlation with. Domain names, there are domains that I've scanned both v4 and v6 where the DNS, when I query v4, only comes back with v4. I have to query it via v6 to get the v6 services. Okay? A lot of people aren't looking at that kind of stuff right now. Fragmentation, there's no consistent way of doing that. Therefore, tools within this space are missing or have major problems with them. Tool leakage, predictability of things. Artifacts is an example. THC Toolkit has specific artifacts that you can define when they were built, is an example, as they're coming through your network. And also ballistics, that is the whole handshake. Can you define a whole connection transition as they're going through an attack? Can you actually profile a botnet from layer 3 and up? Well, actually you can today with v6. TTP, in v4 you really can't identify training sources or vendor products or experience. v6 we can actually trace some of this down, so it makes it a lot easier to find where the attackers come from. Yes, and if you're watching on the video, hello there. How do you set this up and do it inexpensively? Everybody has this type of system or thinking about it maybe? Well, this is what the infrastructure looks like. We have lots of sources. We have open source intelligence. If you are critical infrastructure, you can get things from DHS. Otherwise, you can get stuff from CERT. You have ISACs available. There's commercial sources such as myself. There's some private B2B type services, and there are a lot of other services you can get. So you take all this data in and you process it, and then you make logical sense where the stuff is applied on your network protection devices. And as we know, most of these network protection devices have a limitation of how many blocks can occur. So you have to be very careful that you don't throw, 100,000 on something that doesn't have the memory space to support it. You may end up crashing a switch, a router, a server. So this is a real problem. You have to ingest, you have to analyze, and integrate. First, sensor. Take a look at Security Onion. Have anybody played with Security Onion? Great product, open source. It's on a DVD or downloaded to a CD. It'll run in virtualization. It has many sensors and has these particular graphical components. I've worked with both of these groups to add IPv6, at least visibility here, to make it easier to find things. This is kind of cool. Another thing is ELK, Elasticsearch. This has Log Stash, which allows you to take multiple log formats for free, process them, put them in a standardized Elasticsearch, and the graphical interface, that's all programmable. That particular thing took about a half a day for me, and I'd never seen it. So it was relatively quick to create custom interfaces. By the way, this could also be used for performance besides security or operations. Another one is what Cisco's supporting, which is OpenSoC, which is up on GitHub. What they've done is they've taken, again, a lot of open source components, using Logstash, telemetry information, you bring it in, you collect it, you communicate it, and then you have ways of storing it and doing queries on it. All three of these components some of them are actually better than some of the commercial products in this space today. We can find IPv6 with the first product, with this right here. We can detect a lot of new attacks against IPv6 that we haven't been able to. These provide, again, custom interfaces so that we can show the manager's blinky lights, but we can also provide operational insight into things. Okay, about the CTI environment for threat intelligence. Internet of Things, it's growing. We're going to have peer-to-peer networks. We have gateways. You heard the presentation. The problem with it is that's where the current threat intelligence are. They don't see IPv6. They have no way of processing, and they have no way of context. So there's this big class of problems that exist out there. And by the way, again, this is what's holding back security operations centers to support IPv6, is sensing, monitoring, logging, and some kind of display that will interface into their gear. There's some open source. So what I've done over the last year is I basically have a hazards and awareness and mitigation recommendations for over 10,000 tunnels, proxies, and other things. Equivalents for blacklists and reputations that you can map right back to your Cisco reputation system or somebody else's reputation system. The V4 reputation system has been real interesting. What it does is it tells you where there's proxies that you may not know that hidden proxies exist. So you know that somebody's coming at you anonymously to try to attack you. That's been real interesting. Geolocation, we've been able to restore geolocation not just down to the country like we've seen from MaxMine, but we can get, in some cases, down to the building. Spam blacklists, again, matching the V4 and V6, we've been able to identify a lot of sources of spam. By the way, one of the major sources of spam is in Africa. Their IPv6 network traffic has quadrupled in the last 3 months. I just want to mention that. And also TTP. We can identify the ballistics of an attacker and give you an idea of who that attacker is. That's been pretty cool, and then integrate it into your system. So how do I do this? Well, number one, from the attacker standpoint, I have some 1.2 billion dynamic honeypots out there watching attackers. Yes, as long as I'm having IPv6, I had to have billions of something, right? We also have proactive and scanning, and we also have a lot of listeners around the internet looking for this kind of information. This has been a real interesting exercise on finding a lot of things that I didn't ever expect to find. We can talk about that off camera if you'd like. So to finish this discussion, we developed the system, determine how much intelligence you can act on. Statistically, you may or may not want to act from an attacker standpoint, because then they may know what your game strategy is from a defense standpoint. This comes right into a new set of models for IPv6 security called resilient networks. You may want to look this up at MITRE. This is really where IPv6 needs to go to be able to provide proactive true defense in this particular environment. And that's it. Yes, I didn't get real technical. There was no 0 days dropped, nothing really evil for a change. Questions? Yeah, TTP is the techniques. My mind just went blank, lack of coffee. Yeah. Basically, it tells you their profiling as far as what their practices are. So as an example, one attacker may say, hey, I have these DNS names that my process is I set up DNS names, and there's one criminal activity group that does this. They set up a whole bunch of DNS within minutes. Then they sent out spam to a lot of people and directed spam phishing. But those DNS names only exist, or servers exist on those domains, for 24 hours. Then they evaporate, they go away, they're pointed elsewhere. Or a long-term attack where there's one group that will set up domains 2 years before they have an attack, and they have this whole inventory. And they'll pull them out randomly to identify them. And then the malware that they use, the specific attack tools that they use, the scanning, where they got the information from can be determined. As an example, what if somebody had access to a bunch of insurance records? That would allow direct phishing for a whole population, wouldn't it? That gives a profile on a class of attackers. And that's really what you want to know is, hey, somebody's coming at me and it's them. That way you can appropriately define what the defenses are. Any other questions? Oh, tools, techniques, and practices.
So I'm fairly new to the whole IPv6. This is my first time here, and the last few days have been enlightening.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm in the process of going through the OMB mandates for one of my customers, and this really scares me, and I'm sure it should. My question is, does Special Publication 119 address some of these concerns to really get governmental agencies up running IPv6 on the internet?
119 does a great job. Unfortunately, the security community wasn't engaged. A few of us were engaged that knew what had to happen, but a lot of the security community and a lot of the product vendors weren't engaged in that process. Therefore, that's delayed products that do a great job for customers. And by the way, this is throughout the world. This is everybody's products.
Understood. So my question is, when working with the government on IPv6 deployment, what should I be telling them that, who should I go to find out what we should be doing to secure these agencies?
Well, there happens to be an upcoming presentation, and John, why don't you mention that? Or you can take this offline because this is also being streamed.
Understand. My name is John Lee. I'm on the IAC liaison to the Federal IPv6 Working Group. And if you're not a member of the working group, we'll get you a member. We have various subcommittees, technical subcommittees, and other subject matter experts that we work with the government, including Joe. We suggest that you bring your CISO in because any particular agency has their own CISO and their own security organization. And in terms of setting up your IPv6 team, we suggest you bring your business folks, your mission folks, networking, and include the security individuals to make sure that when you have done your design, when you've done your planning, that you get an authority to operate from your appropriate cognizant authority.
John, can I add two other people? Whoever manages your security operations center is very important. And also, most organizations have a security architect. Bring them in because that will help frame long-term development.
So a comment on that is
yes.
Special Pub 119 offers good guidance. They really did a good job. There's also RFC 7123, which provides a little further detail. Risk assessment is definitely very important. And again, you can start out with interim approval to test and getting to approval to operate through a designated authority. But definitely from a risk assessment standpoint, those SP 119 and RFC 7123 provide a great resource.
I concur. Are you going to take the microphone the whole time, John?
No. There's also, in terms of risk assessment, there's a new set of criteria, and you can go take a look at that, and it's whether it's a moderate risk, a high risk, a low risk, and the appropriate controls you're supposed to have in place. So that's another minor thing.
One other thing is the same controls need to be applied to your IPv6 or partially IPv6 enabled cloud providers. We have found from a security perspective, a lot of organizations have kind of forgotten about their cloud providers and have assumed that they've done it right or they have a security mechanism to protect you. You may be very surprised what is missing in their environment that you have in your environment that they do not have in their environment.
Just another comment to add to that. NIST Special Pub 853 is the guidance that federal systems use. That is a good reference if you're engaging in that community. Also,
version 4.
Say again?
Version 4.
Version 4, thank you. Also, the SANS 20 Critical Controls offers good recommendations for things like continuous monitoring.
The one challenge with the SANS 20 controls, there is no mapping directly to IPv6 controls. You have to have a knowledge of IPv6 to figure out what those controls mean to you in your environment. So it takes some expertise to go through that.
There is a 20 critical controls mapping to 853, but Joe, yeah, thanks for pointing it out, and that's an area that needs to be worked on.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, don't be afraid. Having the knowledge at least allows you to start addressing the issue. That's one of the things that a lot of security operations centers, security teams. One other thing that I want to mention is your red team. If you have a red team for your organization or a pen testing team, they should also be testing for IPv6. It's not very common for them to do it. Or they'll try to use older tools or not use the current techniques that are being used to do testing and validation. Be very careful, though. Some of the tools can drop segments and networks and hosts, so you have to have some context around that. Again, the awareness is the first part of trying to conquer this problem. Boy, not a lot of questions. I guess security being last puts everybody in a haze. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Now, off camera, we get to talk about... you're supposed to cut it now.
Well, thank you, Joe. This was a great presentation. We appreciate it. Thank you. This was the last session as part of the North American IPv6 Summit. Thank you for being with us the last 2 days. We hope the information provided was useful and it will help you be successful in your careers moving forward. Thank you to all the volunteers, members of the North American IPv6 Task Forces who worked hard to put this event together. Thanks to all the presenters that break content. And of course, thanks to our sponsors. Hope to see you again next year. Thank you.